Can you believe that for nearly 2,000 years, a single civilization dominated the ancient world so completely that its name became synonymous with pure, unadulterated horror? Forget Rome, forget the Mongols. Before them all, there was a black shadow that stretched across the Near East. A military force so brutal, so sophisticated in its methods of terror, that when their armies approached the gates of a city, the defenders often simply gave up and waited for the inevitable doom. This is not just history. This is the story of the first true global superpower, an empire built not on trade agreements or treaties, but on the systematic implementation of fear, the mastery of siege warfare, and the terrifying policy of deportation that scattered entire peoples like dust in the wind. They were the Assyrians, and to speak their name in Babylon, in Jerusalem, or even in distant Egypt was to invoke a catastrophe no one saw coming, yet everyone was desperately afraid of. We are going back to the crucible of civilization, to the land between the two great rivers, Mesopotamia, where agriculture flourished and where, tragically, the art of war was perfected to a level that would not be matched for millennia. This is where the story begins, not with mighty kings and golden crowns, but with a small, struggling city-state named Ashur, clinging desperately to the banks of the Tigris River, far north of the famed Sumerian cities. They were initially insignificant, small-time players in a dangerous game ruled by giants like the Akkadians and the Amorites, constantly having to fight just to survive the harsh realities of the northern Mesopotamian plain. But within that desperate struggle, something hardened in the Assyrian character, a resilience, a brutal pragmatism, and a unique religious zealotry that convinced them, and eventually convinced the world, that their patron god Ashur had ordained them to rule the entire earth through iron and fire. They learned early that weakness invites invasion, and they decided, quite deliberately, that they would never be weak again. Their early history is a blur of petty conflicts and tenuous alliances, a period where they existed primarily as highly effective traders, establishing vast commercial networks that stretched across Anatolia and leveraged the revolutionary technology of donkeys for long-distance caravan trade. These seemingly mundane trade routes, however, were the secret infrastructure for their future military machine. They established colonies, like the famous Kanesh, deep in foreign territory, mastering logistics, accumulating wealth, and learning the political weaknesses of their neighbors. This early exposure to the wider world taught them adaptability and provided the silver and tin necessary to forge the weapons that would eventually conquer the known world. They were merchants with a deadly secret. They were charting the map for future invasion routes. The real turning point, the moment the whisper of Ashur became a deafening roar, came around the 18th century BCE with the emergence of the Old Assyrian Empire and the rise of a king whose ambition dwarfed his predecessors, Shamshi-Adad I. This was the man who stopped looking south to Babylon for validation and started looking outward, conquering huge swaths of land, building fortifications, and, most crucially, instilling a centralized, ruthless administration necessary to maintain a true territorial state. Shamshi-Adad understood that a kingdom needed more than just a successful battle. It needed continuous control. He was the prototype of the Assyrian terror king, a ruthless administrator who delegated power to capable sons and ensured that the tribute flowed consistently back to Ashur. He established the very foundation of the Assyrian military philosophy: swift campaigns, overwhelming force, and absolutely zero tolerance for rebellion. If you dared defy Ashur, the response was not punishment, it was obliteration. But even this mighty empire was fragile. History is cruel, and empires rise only to fall back into the dust. Following Shamshi-Adad's death, the powerful city-state of Babylon, under the famous Hammurabi, rose to dominance, and Assyria was momentarily eclipsed, pushed back to its original confines. They spent centuries in a twilight zone, constantly battling aggressive neighbors like the Hurrian Kingdom of Mitanni, who often subjected the Assyrians to vassalage. Imagine the shame! The future masters of the world forced to pay tribute to a neighboring king. This period of subjugation, however, was not one of decline, but one of hardening. It was in this unforgiving environment that the Assyrians perfected the art of the comeback. They studied their enemies' tactics, they waited, and they prepared. They developed a national identity rooted in martyrdom and destiny, fueled by the humiliation of being ruled by others. When they finally broke free, around 1365 BCE, under the leadership of Ashurbanipal I, they exploded onto the scene with a vengeance that shocked the entire Near East. This was the moment history pivoted, moving away from localized city-state conflicts and into the era of the giant, predatory empire. You are about to witness the ascent of a power that defined the very concept of tyranny, how they perfected the tools of conquest, and why their ultimate fate remains one of the most astonishing collapses in all of antiquity. Get ready, because the story of the Assyrian Empire is dark, dazzling, and absolutely unforgettable. We think of them as an unstoppable, overwhelming wave of destruction, but every monster has a birthplace, a single point of origin. For the Assyrians, it wasn't a sprawling metropolis or a lush river delta, but a dusty, seemingly unremarkable city perched precariously on the western bank of the Tigris River, a place they called Assur. This was the holy sanctuary, the spiritual and governmental beating heart of their culture, named after their ferocious chief deity of war, Ashur himself. Before the iron chariots rolled and the bronze axes swung the death knell across the Near East, the earliest Assyrians were not warriors. They were simply the most ambitious, risk-taking merchants the ancient world had ever known. They were shrewd accountants, not savage soldiers, and their first empire was one of trade, not terror. They built an astonishing, complex web of long-distance commercial routes, stretching thousands of miles from Mesopotamia deep into the rugged highlands of Anatolia, operating with a ruthless efficiency usually reserved for military campaigns. They didn't conquer cities with siege engines yet. They conquered them with contracts, silver, and the relentless pursuit of profit, particularly the crucial high-demand trade in tin and fine textiles. Unlike their contemporaries in Babylonia who preferred diplomacy and slow, bureaucratic processes, the Assyrians realized that if you want to truly secure your wealth and your supply chain, you cannot trust others to guard your caravan. You must become the guard, and then you must become the absolute, unquestioned master of the road itself. This critical pivot, from the shrewd salesman calculating inventory and interest rates to the cold-eyed, disciplined soldier calculating battlefield casualties and forced requisitions, was the most pivotal, terrifying moment in their entire dark history. The need for protection metastasized into the craving for domination. They began small, demanding protection money, forcing local chieftains and minor kings to pay a heavy tribute just to allow the Assyrian merchants and their trade goods to pass through safely and quickly. But that tribute quickly evolved from a simple toll into an outright ransom on existence itself. if you dared to refuse, if you tried to cheat the Assyrian caravan master, or if you simply looked too weak to resist, the retribution was immediate, disproportionate, and absolutely terrifying, ensuring that the word Ashur quickly became synonymous not just with commerce, but with inevitable, crushing, spectacular retribution. By the time the Middle Assyrian Empire solidified its grip on power, roughly around the 14th century BCE, the state was no longer merely protecting its economic interests. The entire apparatus of government was rapidly transforming into the ultimate, flawless war machine. Their primary innovation wasn't just in weaponry, though their eventual mastery of iron was certainly formidable. Their true horror lay in their ideology, their organization, and their sheer systemic cruelty. Every single military campaign was meticulously planned years in advance, down to the exact logistical requirements for forced relocation and crop destruction. They perfected the art of psychological warfare, realizing that 1,000 terrified people running away are far more effective at discouraging future resistance than 100 dead soldiers left on the field. But even more destructive, even more deeply unsettling than the initial slaughter, was the Assyrian policy of mass deportation, a policy of social engineering they pioneered and perfected into an art form. This wasn't just punitive revenge, it was calculated, strategic destruction of local identity. They didn't just kill the local leaders. They systematically ripped the entire population, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people in a single campaign, out of their ancestral homes and marched them across the vast, inhospitable stretches of the burgeoning empire. Why commit such staggering organizational labor, moving entire nations like cattle? Because moving entire populations destroyed local identity, shattered any possibility of centralized resistance, and instantly provided the Assyrian central state with free, easily controlled, and disconnected labor for their massive public works, like building their new, impossibly grand capital cities. A proud farmer from the hill country of Israel suddenly found himself digging massive irrigation canals in the sweltering heat of Babylonia, unable to speak the local tongue, unable to find allies, and therefore unable to organize a functional revolt. They replaced the concept of local loyalty with absolute, terrifying, and total dependence on the central power. This was all amplified by their crucial technological edge. The Assyrians were masters of iron, long before most of their rivals had moved beyond the Bronze Age. Iron weapons were cheaper, stronger, and could be mass-produced, equipping vast armies far beyond the capacity of their rivals. More than that, they utterly revolutionized the brutal art of siege warfare. The Assyrians didn't wait for cities to starve into submission, they tore them down methodically. They invented and deployed highly advanced siege engines, the terrifying roofed battering rams that shattered walls previously considered impregnable by any force. They brought sophisticated engineers who diverted rivers, constructed steep ramps up to the defensive walls, and methodically reduced even the most fortified positions into instant smoldering rubble, turning defense from a point of strength into a rapidly accelerating, deadly trap. By the time we enter the era of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, starting around the 9th century BCE, the world knew exactly what was coming when the dust clouds appeared on the horizon and the sound of 10,000 marching boots echoed across the desert floor. The merchant state was gone. The early period of hesitation was over. What remained was a hyper-militarized, ruthlessly centralized, and sophisticated killing machine ruled by kings who genuinely believed they were divinely ordained to inflict punishment and total subjugation upon the entire earth. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was an empire of iron and fear, systematically ready to consume every single civilization from the scorching Persian Gulf to the fertile shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Get ready, because the greatest, most efficient terror campaign in ancient history is about to begin its devastating march. The Assyrian shadow did not merely stretch across Mesopotamia. It was the invention of systematic, state-sponsored terror. The previous eras, the Old and Middle Assyrian periods, were merely the brutal, bloody practice sessions. Now, as the 10th century BCE dawns, we enter the Neo-Assyrian period, the empire's peak. An age defined by the perfect marriage of technological superiority and psychological warfare that would forever stain the records of history. The year is 911 BCE, and the world of brittle bronze is about to shatter beneath the hammer of cheap, lethal iron forged in the furnaces of Ashur. While neighboring kingdoms still relied on costly, scarce copper alloys, the Assyrians had quietly mastered the metallurgy of iron. This wasn't just a new metal, it was the birth of an unstoppable logistical advantage. Iron weapons were cheaper, stronger, and most terrifyingly, they were mass-produced. For the first time, a military machine could equip hundreds of thousands of soldiers with uniform, razor-sharp efficiency. Every Assyrian spear was tougher, every sword capable of cleaving through the bronze defenses of their rivals, and the fear they instilled was immediate and primal. The Iron Age in Mesopotamia truly began with the sound of Assyrian boots marching toward your city walls. It was King Adad-nirari II, ascending to the throne, who took this technological edge and weaponized it into permanent, suffocating policy. His goal was not just temporary raiding, it was the permanent structural domination of the entire Near East. He looked at the fragmented states of the northern Levant and saw not neighbors to be occasionally fought, but resources waiting to be systematically harvested. His campaigns were not impulsive. They were meticulously planned, seasonal tours of utter destruction designed for maximum efficiency. Adad-nirari II established the blueprint for empire. Crush resistance absolutely. Install tribute systems that bled the subjugated dry. And most importantly, ensure that the memory of defiance was far more painful than the immediate act of surrender. He revived the Assyrian heartland and stabilized the borders, setting the stage for the true monsters who would follow. The Assyrian war machine itself was a masterpiece of military engineering and organization, a sight designed to paralyze before the first arrow was even loosed. Imagine the dust cloud rising miles away, followed by the terrifying, rhythmic thunder of their immense heavy siege engines, the true innovation that shattered the myth of the impenetrable city wall. These enormous wooden beasts, often pulled by hundreds of men, were capable of battering down fortifications that had stood for centuries. They made every city vulnerable, turning defense into a desperate, short-lived mistake. The engine's speed, however, came from the chariots, not the flimsy two-man carts common in previous ages, but heavy, four-wheeled behemoths carrying 4 specialized men, a driver, a dedicated shield-bearer, an archer, and a spearman for close-quarters shock. And then came the cavalry, which the Assyrians perfected into a terrifying force. Lightly armored riders, trained to maneuver in formation and deliver punishing volleys of arrows at a distance, tearing through the flanks of disorganized armies like a razor blade through soft earth. This machine was not just powerful, it was relentlessly professional. Soldiers were full-time employees of the state, not seasonal farmers, ensuring a discipline and continuity of terror unmatched in the ancient world. But Adad-nirari II laid the groundwork. The true, horrifying legend was cemented by Ashurbanipal II, r. 883 to 859 BCE. This man was not merely a conqueror, he was a performance artist of suffering, turning atrocity into state theater. The Assyrian royal inscriptions, usually dry records of logistics and tribute, transform under Ashur-nasirpal's reign into graphic, boastful manifestos of torture, carved in public view on the walls of his newly built capital. He was history's first great monarch to truly weaponize propaganda and atrocity reports, ensuring his reputation preceded his armies by months, causing panic and preemptive collapse. The goal was brutally simple. When the Assyrian scouting parties approached a city, the inhabitants should already be arguing about who gets to open the gates fastest, not whether they should fight. Submission was the only rational choice. This was not random sadism. It was state-sponsored, systematic policy aimed at infrastructure control and economic exploitation. Every campaign brought back immense wealth: gold, silver, livestock, and, critically, people. These captured populations were not merely slaves. They were the essential fuel for the engine of Assyrian expansion. The empire formalized mass deportation, relocating skilled artisans, farmers, and builders across the vast territory. This forced migration served 2 purposes. It removed defiant populations from their homelands, thus eliminating future revolts, and it transplanted the necessary labor and knowledge to build Assyria's magnificent future. They were building roads, canals, and breathtaking new capitals like Kalhu, Nimrud. The dark paradox of the Assyrian terror was that the more brutally they conquered, the more magnificent and technologically advanced their own civilization became. Kalhu, established by Ashur-nasirpal II, was transformed into a city of unparalleled splendor, showcasing the spoils of war. He decorated his palace walls not just with scenes of battle, but with highly detailed, immense reliefs of the royal hunt. The lion hunt, in particular, was the ultimate display of royal power, symbolically equating the king's effortless dominion over the savage beast with his total, brutal mastery over rebellious humanity and minor kings. These magnificent, terrifying palaces were intended to be permanent, psychological monuments, a constant, suffocating reminder that the king who hunted lions for sport would certainly not hesitate to hunt down any minor potentate who dared to miss a tribute payment. This was the dark, intoxicating high point of Assyrian power, built on the bones of a shattered world. But even this system of perfected cruelty would require more expansion, more resources, and an even greater focus on the rich targets to the west, pulling the Assyrians inevitably toward the ultimate prize, the jewel of the Levant, the powerful kingdom of Israel. The moment had arrived. The shadow that had crawled out of Ashur now stretched across the Euphrates, blotting out the sun over the fertile valleys of the west. Israel, Judah, Damascus, these were not merely neighboring states. They were banks waiting to be robbed, sources of wealth, timber, and manpower that the insatiable Assyrian war machine absolutely demanded. The kings of the Levant, foolish and fractured by their own petty squabbles, suddenly realized too late that the enemy at their doorstep was not a skirmishing band of raiders, but an organized, systemic, and utterly relentless force of destruction. They had played their political games, aligning and realigning, paying tribute one year and withholding it the next, believing the sheer distance offered them insulation. They were gravely, horrifyingly mistaken. The new breed of Assyrian ruler, hardened by generations of conquest and possessing sophisticated logistical systems, viewed distance not as a barrier, but as a challenge to be overcome with swift, brutal efficiency. We enter the age of Tiglath-Pileser III, a man who didn't just conquer nations, but systematically dissolve them. He was the architect of the modern empire, moving beyond simple tribute collection to total, absolute absorption and restructuring. Why such an elaborate, cruel process? Because loyal subjects are difficult to maintain, but displaced, disoriented, terrified people, stripped of their cultural roots and reliant entirely on the central government for survival, become perfectly manageable slaves. He broke the cycle of rebellion by simply removing the rebels and replacing them with foreigners, creating a terrifying mosaic of fear and isolation that spanned thousands of miles. The psychological warfare was just as potent as the iron swords they wielded. His legions moved like a dark tide. First, they crushed the Syrian coalition around Damascus, erasing that ancient kingdom's independence forever. Then their gaze, cold and unwavering, fixed upon the rich, defiant cities of Israel. The Kingdom of Israel, known as Samaria, was the first major domino to fall in the north. They dared to align themselves against Assyria, seeking help from Egypt, a power that was consistently too slow, too weak, or too self-interested to ever truly offer rescue. Tiglath-Pileser III struck first, reducing their territory, annexing their lands, and demanding crushing tribute. But Israel, stubborn and ultimately suicidal, rebelled again under the shadow of the great Sargon II. Sargon II, a military genius and a terrifying administrator, was not a man to negotiate with treachery. In 722 BCE, after a brutal siege that lasted 3 years, Samaria fell. The capital was erased from the map, its sophisticated architecture reduced to ash and dust. The historical record is chillingly precise. Sargon claims to have deported 27,290 people from Samaria and integrated them into the eastern frontiers of his empire. These were the infamous 10 lost tribes of Israel, not lost by wandering, but violently removed and absorbed into the Assyrian machine, never to return as a unified entity. Their gods were powerless, their kings were slaughtered, and their history was forcibly rewritten as a footnote in the grand, bloody chronicle of Ashur. This was not war, it was extinction. The small southern kingdom of Judah watched this catastrophe unfold in paralyzed terror. Their king, Hezekiah, a man of profound faith and equally profound political skill, understood the game better than his northern cousins. He knew that outright defiance meant certain annihilation, but total submission meant cultural death. He was playing a razor-thin geopolitical game, attempting to appease the monster while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable moment when the monster decided his tribute was no longer enough. Hezekiah fortified Jerusalem, famously building the massive Siloam Tunnel to ensure the city's water supply remained protected, even under the most devastating siege. He was preparing for the ultimate showdown, a desperate gamble for survival against a force that had never known defeat. He paid massive tribute, sending Assyria tons of silver and gold, sacrificing the treasures of the temple and the palace simply to buy time, a few precious years of breathing room before the inevitable return of the conqueror. But even the most brilliant defensive preparations cannot stop the tide when the king of the world decides to turn his full attention upon you. The next great wave was about to crash, and this time it was guided by the most ruthless hand in Assyrian history. Enter Sennacherib, the great builder of Nineveh, but first and foremost the supreme executioner of the Assyrian will. He was furious. Hezekiah had dared to withhold tribute and even shelter Assyrian enemies, a direct challenge to the supremacy of the empire. This was an affront that required not punishment, but obliteration. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib launched a campaign so devastating, so swift, that it reads like a natural disaster in the historical accounts. He swept through the coastal cities, reducing 46 fortified cities of Judah to rubble, imprisoning hundreds of thousands of people, and turning the entire countryside into a smoldering ruin. His own annals boast of trapping Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a caged bird. The terror was absolute. The gates of Jerusalem were locked, the walls were manned by frantic defenders, and outside, the Assyrian army, the largest, most technologically advanced fighting force on the planet, was preparing the final assault. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The siege engines were being rolled into place, and the fate of this last independent pocket in the Levant hung precariously on the will of the gods and the strength of the walls. This was the moment of historical silence. Would Jerusalem fall like Samaria? Would Judah be erased from existence? The shadow of the winged bull loomed largest then, poised to crush the final piece of independence in the West, sealing its status as the uncontested master of the known world. But history, as always, held one final, terrifying twist in its narrative, a twist born of plague, politics, or sheer unimaginable luck. The world had gone silent. The Assyrian engine of conquest, the relentless gears of mass slaughter, had finally stopped moving, not because it was broken, but because, for a brief, impossible moment, there was nothing left on the map that truly mattered enough to challenge it directly. Nineveh, the terrifying capital, believed it had achieved permanence, a state of eternal, unchallenged dominion over the cradle of civilization and all its terrified neighbors. This was the world inherited by Ashurbanipal, a king unlike any who came before him, a man of lethal paradoxes, a master strategist and brutalizer who nonetheless preferred the quiet solitude of his magnificent library to the bloody noise of the battlefield. But do not, for 1 second, be fooled by the clay tablets and the grand ambition of preserving every scrap of knowledge from 1,000 years of Mesopotamian history. Ashurbanipal was no less brutal than his grandfather Sennacherib. He simply understood that the infrastructure of terror needed an intellectual framework to last forever. That systematic knowledge was the ultimate weapon against chaos. His famous library was not a peaceful monument to learning, it was a curated archive of power, a testament to what Assyria controlled, what it remembered, and what it mercilessly destroyed. Every epic, every astronomical observation, every administrative decree was stamped with the seal of the empire that had devoured the world, proving that even thought itself bowed before the king of the four quarters. Yet the sheer, crushing, unsustainable weight of maintaining this impossible empire was starting to show the hairline cracks that no amount of scholarly oversight or military terror could mend. The Assyrian heartland was small, relying entirely on continuous conquest and tribute, but the territories they ruled stretched impossibly far, from the Nile in Egypt, across the Levant, deep into Anatolia, and down to the volatile Persian Gulf. This vastness required unprecedented levels of administrative loyalty and rapid communication, and when one of those pillars failed, the entire top-heavy structure began to groan under its own monumental weight. The first seismic tremor came not from a distant foreign enemy, but from within the royal family itself, a chilling, fratricidal betrayal that exposed the deep, fatal flaw in Assyria's dynastic planning. Ashurbanipal's own twin brother, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, whom the great king had installed as the subservient puppet king of Babylon, suddenly decided he wanted to cut the strings holding his life hostage. This was not a minor protest. This was a coordinated, massive geopolitical conspiracy, the ultimate middle finger raised against the supreme global power, executed with the cold calculation of a man who had shared a cradle with his enemy. Shamash-Shum-Ukin marshaled every single disgruntled, terrified, and oppressed vassal state he could find. The fierce Elamites from the east, the tenacious Chaldeans of the southern marshlands, the nomadic Arabs, and the remnants of the old Babylonian nobility, all united by one terrifying, desperate hope: to see Nineveh burn. For 4 agonizing years, the civil war raged, tearing the empire apart from the inside, forcing Ashurbanipal to recall elite forces he desperately needed to patrol his distant, restive borders. This internal conflict was the deadliest virus the empire had ever faced, infecting the very concept of Assyrian invincibility and forcing the world to recognize the empire's vulnerability. It culminated in the brutal, agonizing siege of Babylon itself, a confrontation of unimaginable horror where the Assyrian war machine was forced to grind down the very city their own royal family inhabited. The famine inside the city walls became so acute, the desperate inhabitants reportedly resorted to cannibalism, a tragedy amplified by the awareness that the starvation was being inflicted by their supposed overlords. When the defenses finally crumbled and the city fell to the besiegers, the end was apocalyptic, designed to set a terrifying example for all time. Shamash-Shum-Ukin, rather than face the humiliation, the prolonged torture, and the execution designed specifically by his merciless brother, allegedly set his own royal palace on fire and was consumed by the scorching flames, taking his court and his failed rebellion with him. Ashurbanipal had won. He crushed the uprising, obliterated the powerful Elamite kingdom which had dared to interfere, and reaffirmed Assyria's total, undisputed dominance across the Fertile Crescent. But the victory was a poison pill, a hollow triumph that masked a profound structural exhaustion. The effort had bled the treasury dry, irrevocably exhausted the elite standing army in a fight against their own countrymen, and most crucially, revealed to the world a terrifying, exhilarating truth. The great beast could, in fact, be mortally wounded. While Ashurbanipal was focused on internal survival and securing the southern provinces, the shadows were gathering rapidly on the northern and eastern frontiers, shadows made of horsehair, iron, and unrelenting, vengeful hunger. These were the peoples Assyria had consistently tried to pacify, the mountainous, independent tribes they had scorned as barbaric and unsophisticated. Now they were unified, organized, and seeking absolute vengeance. To the north rode the terrifying Scythians, nomadic warriors whose sheer speed and unexpected ruthlessness were a perfect counterpoint to the slow, heavy Assyrian chariots, capable of striking deep into the heartland and vanishing into the vast plains before a proper response could be mounted. And to the east, the Medes, once a scattered collection of disparate tribal groups, were rapidly coalescing into a single formidable military state under powerful leaders who had learned their cold lessons directly from Assyria's systematic playbook. They had watched the systematic cruelty, they had seen the terrifying efficiency of the military organization, and now they were ready to turn those very terrifying lessons back onto the teacher with interest. Ashurbanipal, in a moment of desperate hubris, or perhaps sheer logistical necessity, chose a policy of fatal appeasement toward the Scythians, inviting them into his sphere of influence, hoping to use them as an aggressive buffer against the rising power of the Medes. It was a classic, fatal miscalculation of history. You do not invite a hungry, unpredictable wolf into the sheep pen simply because you fear the bear in the forest. The wolf will simply eat both the sheep and the grass. The Scythians, having seen the incredible wealth of the Assyrian cities and the clear, deep cracks in their defenses during the brutal civil war, began to act less like allies and more like opportunistic, unbridled predators, treating Assyrian territory as their personal hunting ground. The last great king of Assyria had managed to conquer every major power the world could offer, but he could not conquer the relentless forces of entropy and the sheer logistical impossibility of holding the ancient world captive indefinitely. When Ashurbanipal died sometime around 627 BCE, the Assyrian Empire still officially existed, its name still invoking immediate, breathless fear, but the lifeblood had been drained, and the military machine was sputtering desperately on fumes. The historical records of his successors become suspiciously sparse, suggesting either a rapid, fearful decline or a desperate attempt by his deeply inadequate sons to conceal the horrifying truth from history itself. The glorious reign of the Scholar King ended not with a bang of final conquest, but with a terrifying, ominous silence, leaving the stage set for his politically inept heirs to inherit a massive, crumbling house built entirely of the sand of fear. The Medes were already mobilizing ruthlessly in the eastern mountains. The Babylonians were regaining their strength under a fierce new Chaldean dynasty. And the final, catastrophic moment of history's greatest reckoning was finally, truly at hand. It was time for the world to stop trembling and to start fighting back with the same brutal tools Assyria had taught them. The silence was broken not by a trumpet blast, but by the unified shudder of nations finally realizing they had nothing left to lose. Fear had been Assyria's greatest weapon. Now, the sheer, crushing weight of that fear was transmuted into the most dangerous kind of courage, the courage of the desperate. The clock had run out, and the scattered sparks of rebellion, for decades quickly and mercilessly crushed beneath the Assyrian heel, were about to ignite the largest coordinated attack the region had ever witnessed against the ultimate predator. Nabopolassar, the Chaldean king who had seized control of the ancient, glorious city of Babylon while the Assyrian gaze was momentarily diverted, was not a traditional monarch. He was a revolutionary, a man hardened by years of servitude and calculated defiance. He knew that Babylon's fragile independence was an illusion unless the source of all terror, Nineveh, was utterly extinguished. His counterpart in this terrifying partnership was Cyaxares, the king of the Medes. While the Chaldeans provided the political legitimacy and the tactical genius, the Medes brought the pure, unadulterated force of mountain vengeance. They were the people of the eastern highlands, long brutalized, remembering every tribute payment, every raid, every humiliation carved into their memory. Cyaxares was a king forged in fire, a leader who understood the Assyrian method intimately, and he intended to apply those same brutal tools, magnified tenfold, right back onto the empire's throat. These two men, Chaldean guile and Median ruthlessness, entered into the most consequential alliance in ancient Near Eastern history. The target was not some border fortress or rebellious vassal. The target was the heart, the soul, the ancestral origin point of Assyria itself. In 614 BCE, the Medes struck with the speed of a desert windstorm, bypassing the political capital of Nineveh for the spiritual capital, Ashur. Ashur, the city that gave the empire its name, the home of the high god Ashur, was more than a city. It was a symbol of divine mandate, the anchor of Assyrian identity. Its fall would not just be a military defeat, it would be a theological catastrophe for the Assyrians, shattering the very foundation of their belief in their god's superiority and protection. The fire that consumed Ashur was the signal flare the rest of the world had been waiting for. It was proof, undeniable and terrifying. The giant could bleed, and its wounds were mortal. Nabopolassar arrived late to the Feast of Vengeance, finding only ruins and Cyaxares' bloody congratulations. It was there, amidst the smoldering, sacred wreckage of the old gods, that they formalized the alliance. They cemented their pact with the oldest and most enduring political tool, marriage. A Babylonian prince, Nebuchadnezzar, would marry a Median princess, Amytis. Two distinct powers, one from the fertile river valley and one from the harsh mountains, were bound not just by treaty but by blood, mutual hatred, and a shared singular vision of a world without the Assyrian shadow. The combined host, Chaldeans, Medes, remnants of Elamites, and even nomadic Scythian mercenaries hired for their sheer savage effectiveness, then turned their gaze north. The final, ultimate target loomed: Nineveh, the city that Sennacherib had built into the jewel of the Tigris, the monument to human terror, a metropolitan expanse that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. Its defenses were legendary, the crowning achievement of Assyrian engineering and paranoia. Massive double walls, rising perhaps 70 feet high, wide enough for multiple chariots to race across their ramparts, reinforced with stone battlements and protected by deep, formidable moats fed by the Kosor River. The Assyrians, under their final king Sin-shar-ishkun, knew this was the end. They fought with the frantic, cornered brutality they had perfected over centuries. This was not a quick rout. This was a grinding, desperate, year-long siege that began in the summer of 612 BCE. The Allies deployed the full spectrum of siege warfare, sappers digging beneath the foundations, battering rams pounding the sheer stone, and wave after wave of desperate infantry attacks. The city held fast, defiant, protected by its architecture and the ingrained Assyrian belief in their own invincibility. But then, something happened that no human siege engineer, no Babylonian or Median planner, could have factored into their designs. The gods, or just the raw, unpredictable fury of the Mesopotamian climate, intervened in the most catastrophic way possible. Unprecedented rains began to fall. The Tigris River, usually a predictable defensive barrier, swelled into a raging, unimaginable torrent. The water rose, creeping up the mighty walls, turning the defensive moats into aggressive, consuming enemies, destabilizing the very foundations of the seemingly eternal city. The breach was not made by the slow grind of a battering ram, but by water erosion. A massive section of the outer wall, perhaps weakened by years of deferred maintenance or simply washed away by the torrent, collapsed suddenly and violently into the roaring mud. The gate to the Assyrian nightmare was ripped open, not by human strength, but by nature's fury. The Allied armies poured through the gaping wound in the city's defense. The final hours of Nineveh were not a battle, they were an execution, a horrific mirroring of every atrocity the Assyrians had ever committed. Sin-Sharishkan, faced with the absolute end of his world, reportedly chose the only exit left. He ordered a massive pyre built in the palace and perished in the flames. A final, dramatic act befitting a dynasty that lived and died by fire and terror. When the smoke cleared, the Allies worked with relentless efficiency to erase the memory of their enemy. The palace libraries, filled with the boastful annals of conquest and cruelty, were shattered. The magnificent artwork detailing mass deportations and impalements was defaced. Nineveh, the greatest city the world had ever known, was systematically dismantled, its structures left as mounds of rubble, ensuring that the source of global terror would never rise again. This was not just a victory, it was an act of deliberate historical annihilation. The shadow had lifted, but the darkness it left behind was profound. The Assyrian Empire was gone, but the weapons it perfected, total war, psychological terror, and the systematic cruelty of empire, had now been inherited by its executioners. The dust had barely settled over the ruins of Nineveh, the corpse of the great city still smoking, when the victors, the unlikely coalition of the Medes and the Babylonians, faced a chilling new problem. How do you govern a ghost? The Assyrian Empire, for centuries the beating heart of terror, had vanished so completely, so violently, that it left a political vacuum unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. It was not just a regime change, it was an extinction event. The great cities, Ashur, Kalhu, Nineveh, were not merely defeated, they were systematically stripped of their power, their monuments defiled, and their libraries burned, ensuring that the very memory of the Assyrian name would struggle to survive. The silence that followed the roar of the final battle was perhaps the most frightening sound of all, a terrifying quiet that implied not peace, but the calculated, methodical carving up of the spoils of history's greatest terror machine. The division of the spoils was swift, brutal, and meticulously planned. The Medes, rugged warriors from the Iranian plateau, claimed the vast northern and eastern highlands, the ancient Assyrian heartland itself, including the territory around the former capital, Ashur. Cyaxares, the Median king, now commanded a domain stretching far into Anatolia, a true empire forged in the fires of vengeance and defined by the destruction of their ancient foe. This acquisition was strategic, securing the mountain passes and resource-rich territories that had long fed the Assyrian war machine, ensuring that the Medes, once subservient tributaries, now controlled the very source of imperial power. Meanwhile, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, under the cunning Nabopolassar, took the Fertile Crescent, the rich agricultural lands of Mesopotamia, and crucially, the western provinces all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. This move positioned Babylon perfectly to dominate trade routes and inherit the mantle of regional supremacy, placing them directly in confrontation with a weakened but still ambitious Egypt. It was a chilling realization. The world had replaced one terrifying superpower with two ambitious, hungry ones, each eager to prove they had learned the lessons of Assyrian dominance and cruelty. And what of the people who once proudly called themselves Assyrian? The brutal irony was not lost on the few who survived the final genocidal sieges. They were subjected to the very same policies their emperors had perfected: mass displacement, forced labor, and aggressive cultural erasure. They became stateless refugees in their own former empire, dispersed among the Babylonian and Median populations, desperately clinging to fragments of their identity. Their historical memory was actively suppressed. Records were destroyed, the great works of literature and science accumulated over centuries were scattered or buried beneath the rubble, ensuring the narrative of their terror would be replaced by the narrative of their deserved destruction. For a time, the name Assyria became synonymous not with power, but with a cautionary tale of ultimate hubris and total destruction, a footnote to the new Babylonian age. The few remaining administrative centers that still held out, mostly in the western edges controlled by Egyptian auxiliaries who desperately feared a Babylonian takeover, were quickly mopped up. But even those holdouts were fundamentally broken, isolated fragments of a colossal military machine that had stopped working forever, leaving behind only the rubble and the echoes of its victims. The true inheritor of Assyria's psychological warfare and organizational genius was not the Med, focused on securing the highlands, but the Babylonian, specifically Nabopolassar's son, the legend who would soon cast his own colossal shadow across history, Nebuchadnezzar II. He was not just a conqueror, he was a builder and a methodical administrator who understood that power wasn't just about swords and terror, but about spectacle, infrastructure, and absolute control. Nebuchadnezzar II took the unimaginable wealth plundered from Nineveh and poured it into transforming Babylon into the most breathtaking, myth-shattering city the world had ever seen. The legendary Hanging Gardens, the colossal azure-tiled Ishtar Gate, the towering Etemenanke Ziggurat, these were not merely architectural marvels built for beauty. They were the calculated, awe-inspiring propaganda of the New World Order. He was demonstrating loudly and clearly that while Assyria specialized in the terror of the whip and the torture stake, Babylon would specialize in the terror of divine magnificence and insurmountable wealth. The world was meant to look upon Babylon's glory and instantly forget the trauma of Nineveh, substituting one fear for another, far more sophisticated form of domination. The most immediate test of Nebuchadnezzar's new power came in the west, where the Assyrians had spent 2 centuries crushing resistance in the Levant, particularly the strategically vital kingdom of Judah. When Assyria fell, Judah, foolishly believing they had found freedom from the yoke, tried to align themselves with Egypt, a fatal, catastrophic mistake that mirrored the desperate rebellions crushed by Sargon and Sennacherib 100 years prior. Nebuchadnezzar inherited the Assyrian blueprint for control over these restive buffer states. He knew exactly where the weak points were and utilized the same road networks and intelligence-gathering systems developed by his predecessors. The campaign against the West, which included the destruction of Ashkelon and the repeated subjugation of Jerusalem, was less a new invasion and more a continuation of Assyrian policy executed by Babylonian hands, but with even greater long-term focus. The climactic siege of Jerusalem, culminating in 587 BCE, was the final, tragic echo of Assyrian methods. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a total state destruction, complete with the mass deportation of the elite, the infamous Babylonian exile, a refined, efficient version of the systematic relocations Assyria had pioneered to break a people's will and national cohesion. The world learned that merely changing the nameplate on the imperial throne did not change the inherent, crushing nature of empire. The Assyrian lesson that absolute power required absolute control over population movement, resource management, and identity was now being applied with terrifying precision by the Chaldean dynasty. This was the true, cursed legacy of the forgotten giant. Its mechanisms of terror were now universal. One of the most insidious and lasting legacies of the vanished empire was the infrastructure itself. The massive network of roads, the integrated relay stations, the sophisticated cuneiform bureaucracy, designed to manage vast resources and collect tribute with terrifying efficiency, did not simply disappear with the sacking of the capitals. The Babylonians and Medes were smart enough to realize that destroying the engine of administration would cripple their own nascent empires. They kept the Assyrian scribal schools running, merely replacing the imperial seals and changing the official dialect from Akkadian to Aramaic, which the Assyrians had already popularized as the commercial lingua franca. The methods of terror required detailed accounting, and the Assyrian system was a masterpiece of efficiency, a cold, hard logic applied to human suffering. The standardized weights and measures, the census records, the methods of complex taxation, all transitioned seamlessly, ensuring that even in death, Assyria still dictated the economic and administrative structure of the new world. This was the ultimate, tragic victory of the Assyrian machine. Even those who hated it most, those who burned its monuments in a frenzy of revenge, could not afford to dismantle its efficiency. They had inherited the ghost of the empire, and that ghost demanded continuous, merciless tribute. The successor states tried to forget the terror, but they had merely inherited the throne of a colossal, perfected tyranny. The kings who sat upon that throne in its final century of dominance, the Sargonids, did not just wage war. They engineered history itself, using human suffering as their primary material. They were the masters of institutionalized cruelty, and the world held its breath, waiting for the next decree of annihilation to be delivered by the iron will of the Assyrian state machine. This was the golden age of terror, a period where the efficiency of the empire reached its zenith, and its reach stretched across the known world, leaving nothing but dust and trauma in its wake. Sargon II was not born to the crown. He seized it in a dark, necessary coup that stabilized a fracturing realm and unleashed a new era of absolute power across the Fertile Crescent. He was the architect of the final, terrifying wave, culminating in the construction of his magnificent, impenetrable city, Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon. The walls were guarded by the colossal, winged, human-headed bulls, the Lamassu, staring out with cold, stone eyes, a permanent warning. We see everything, and we never forgive. The very air around Sargon's fortress was thick with the silent screams of those who had been forced to transport the massive cedar logs from Lebanon and quarry the heavy basalt stone from distant lands, all so one man could solidify his sudden, overwhelming dominance. He was the usurper who proved himself the deadliest of kings, securing the borders, conquering Israel, and ensuring that the tribute flowed like a river of gold, silver, and broken promises directly into his treasury. Then came Sennacherib, a king obsessed with both magnificent creation and total, unimaginable annihilation. He took the capital to Nineveh and transformed it into the jewel of the ancient world, using engineering marvels, massive aqueducts stretching dozens of miles to feed its vast population and its legendary gardens. After a long, infuriating series of uprisings, Sennacherib made a decision so radical, so profoundly chilling, that it echoed across millennia. Babylon had to be erased completely, wiped from the map as if it had never existed. He ordered his armies not just to sack the city, but to dismantle every single stone, to plow the sacred ground, and then, in a terrifying display of environmental warfare, he diverted the Euphrates River over the ruins. The hallowed ground was turned into a desolate, unforgiving swamp, ensuring that no trace of its ancient temples or glorious history would ever remain. A systematic, cultural genocide executed with cold, precise engineering. The message sent was clear. Even the gods of Babylon could not save it from the wrath of Ashur. This act shocked the entire Near East, demonstrating that Assyria's cruelty knew no religious or political boundary. Yet, the empire, like a mythical hydra, found ways to regenerate, even thrive, under its self-inflicted wounds. His son, Esarhaddon, temporarily reversed the curse, rebuilding Babylon with a politically shrewd maneuver designed to win over the southern elites, a tactical concession made from a position of unassailable strength. But while he offered mercy to the south, he extended the cold steel fist of Assyria further than any king before him. It was Esarhaddon who achieved the impossible, the true marker of global dominance, the conquest of Egypt. This was not just a battle. It was a massive logistical nightmare, marching the entire war machine, legions of chariots and infantry, across the unforgiving expanse of the Sinai Desert, delivering the final, humiliating blow to the oldest civilization on Earth. Memphis fell, Thebes was sacked, and the pharaohs bowed down, sending their sons to Nineveh as hostages. The world trembled, knowing that nowhere was truly safe from the pale shadow of the Assyrian standard, not even the land of the Nile gods. Finally, we arrive at Ashurbanipal, the last truly great king, who embodied the empire's ultimate, disturbing contradiction, the scholarly warlord. He was a man who spent his days studying cuneiform texts and writing intellectual treatises, yet he ruthlessly crushed the Elamite civilization utterly, subjecting their capital of Susa to a campaign of such thorough, maniacal destruction. His armies literally salted the earth, stole the very bones of their kings from their tombs, and wiped their memory from the face of history, ensuring their culture would never rise again. When he celebrated his victory over Elam and the Arabs, he did so with the captured enemy kings harnessed to his own royal chariot, pulling him through the streets of Nineveh, the ultimate symbol of subjugation. Yet this same man was the patron of the legendary Library of Nineveh, a monumental collection of all human knowledge, religious texts, and historical records amassed from every single conquered territory. He did not just destroy knowledge, he hoarded it, cataloging thousands of tablets, ensuring that the intellectual heritage of every civilization he crushed would be preserved, but only under the roof of the Assyrian king. This was the final, terrifying refinement of the Assyrian methodology: total physical domination coupled with total intellectual control. The body was broken, the mind was archived, and the entire civilization was rendered a footnote in the grand, bloody history written by the Sargon dynasty. But even at this peak, even with the wealth of the entire world pouring into Nineveh, the colossal machine was straining under its own impossible weight, an internal tension building toward an unbelievable, cataclysmic snapping point. The weight of the world was now centered on the plains of Nineveh, a city so opulent, so completely drenched in the spoils of 3 continents, that its very existence seemed to defy the laws of history. Ashurbanipal, the king of kings, was not just building palaces, he was trying to build eternity. His famous library, an archive unlike any the world had ever seen, was a testament to this impossible ambition, a desperate attempt to catalog the universe before it all burned down. He gathered clay tablets detailing everything from ancient Sumerian epics to mundane economic reports, believing that through knowledge Assyria could achieve immortality, somehow insulating itself from the violent cycles it had inflicted upon every neighbor. But even as the scholars meticulously carved cuneiform, the ground outside the capital was shifting, tectonic plates of resentment grinding against the fragile veneer of Assyrian dominance. The cost of endless, glorious war had finally begun to exceed the profits of conquest. The logistical nightmare of feeding, arming, and maneuvering those massive armies across mountains and deserts demanded a perpetual flow of tribute, a river of gold that could never run dry. The system was designed for maximum extraction, but maximum extraction eventually reaches zero. When the campaigns momentarily slowed, the governors found themselves forced to squeeze the subject populations even harder, draining the last drops of labor and resources from lands already rendered fallow by generations of merciless extraction. This wasn't merely taxation. This was the systematic dismantling of entire regional economies, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and a population with absolutely nothing left to lose. And that, my friends, is the most dangerous kind of enemy you can possibly create. The empire was suffering from administrative fatigue, a crushing burnout caused by maintaining a constant state of global oppression. The sheer psychological stress of being the world's terrorizer, always having to be ready for the next rebellion, had worn down the imperial core. The Assyrian military, while still peerless in open battle, was spread impossibly thin, stretched from the swamps of the Persian Gulf up to the borders of Anatolia, trying to police 1,000 simmering resentments simultaneously. Every garrison was a potential target. Every provincial governor was living on borrowed time. And then the center of gravity snapped. When Ashurbanipal finally disappeared from the historical record, we don't know exactly when or how. History simply stops recording the triumphs. A terrifying silence fell over the throne of Nineveh. The great king was gone, and the vacuum he left was catastrophic. This internal conflict was the crack in the dam, the signal the subject peoples had been desperately waiting for. For generations, the name Assyria had been a paralyzing narcotic of fear, a word whispered in the dark to silence crying children. But now, the drug was wearing off. They saw weakness, they saw confusion, and most importantly, they saw that the iron grip was momentarily loosened, offering a tiny, bloody window of opportunity that they knew would never appear again. Out in the rugged mountains to the east, a formidable new power was organizing itself: the Medes. Led by the ruthlessly pragmatic King Cyaxares, these people were not disorganized tribal groups. They were a growing military federation that had learned the Assyrian way of war, the hard, brutal way, by suffering under it for decades. They watched, they waited, and they prepared themselves to seize the moment when the behemoth finally stumbled, sharpening their bronze blades and perfecting their cavalry tactics. This wasn't just another revolt. This was a strategic and organized campaign, seizing key strategic strongholds in the south, cutting off Assyria's vital trade routes, and isolating the Assyrian garrisons one by one. The impossible was happening. The Medes, the mountain warriors, and the Babylonians, the masters of the fertile plain, were finding common cause. Their shared objective was not merely independence, but the complete and utter annihilation of the Assyrian name, a mission fueled by centuries of blood spilled and atrocities committed. They formed a pact of blood, a terrifying alliance that history had never anticipated, uniting two disparate cultures under one banner of pure, distilled vengeance. Nineveh, the great fortress, suddenly found itself surrounded by a tightening noose, the sound of the enemy closing in, echoing in the halls where kings had once boasted of carving the names of their victims onto the walls of their triumphant palaces. The final curtain was about to rise on the most shocking, rapid, and deserved collapse the ancient world had ever witnessed. A storm of retribution gathering force that would wipe Assyria entirely from the map. The thunder did not just rumble, it tore the sky open. For centuries, the name Assyria meant perpetual midnight, a state of affairs so immutable that civilizations had forgotten what freedom even felt like, accepting the boot on their neck as the natural order of the cosmos. Now, with the great, terrible king Ashurbanipal finally laid to rest, the iron grip he had maintained through sheer psychological warfare and ruthless administration began to relax just enough for a desperate world to test the chain. What followed was not a slow decline, not a graceful fading, but an immediate, violent amputation. The moment the strongest hand was lifted, in 627 BCE, a civil war erupted in Nineveh, tearing at the very heart of the monster machine. This wasn't just a political squabble. It was the inevitable, self-devouring chaos that happens when a society built solely on conquest runs out of external victims and turns its horrifying efficiency inward. Three pretenders fought for the crown, draining the military resources, bankrupting the treasury, and perhaps most critically, proving to every single vassal state that the apex predator was suddenly wounded and distracted. The stench of weakness was like blood in the water, and the sharks were already circling, sensing the opportunity they had prayed for across generations of torment. The first great tremor came from the south, from the bruised and deeply humiliated land of Babylon. Under the leadership of Nabopolassar, a man whose very existence was a testament to defiant resilience, the Babylonians rose, shaking off decades of enforced subservience to Assyrian puppet regimes. They didn't just revolt, they declared war on the memory of Assyria, swearing an oath of annihilation on the ruins of their own temples. But Babylon alone, even revitalized, could not tear down the fortress. They needed fire, and that fire came from the east, from the fierce, disciplined, and mountain-hardened people known as the Medes, led by the legendary King Cyaxares. Cyaxares was not seeking mere independence. He was seeking vengeance for the brutal campaigns Sargon II had waged against his ancestors, a multi-generational blood debt finally coming due. The alliance forged between Nabopolassar and Cyaxares was the most potent, destructive coalition the Near East had ever seen, a unity born purely of shared, searing hatred. They saw Assyria not as a geopolitical rival, but as a plague that needed to be permanently eradicated from the face of the earth, a historical aberration that had to be undone. The assault began with terrifying speed in 616 BCE. Nabopolassar first secured the entire southern frontier, pushing the fractured Assyrian garrisons back toward their homeland. The Assyrians, relying on fear and past glory, found their legendary terror tactics were suddenly impotent against armies driven by pure, righteous fury. Fear had finally turned into fanatical courage. When Nabopolassar arrived shortly thereafter, he found a scene of total devastation, the air thick with ash and the smell of defeat. The two kings met amidst the ruins of the sacred city and solidified their pact with an unbreakable covenant, exchanging oaths of eternal friendship and mutual destruction of their common enemy. The message was unmistakable. Assyria was already dead. They were simply performing the burial rites. The combined forces, now massive and relentless, turned their gaze toward the last great bastion, Nineveh, the crown jewel, the city built by Sennacherib to be the center of the world. Nineveh's defenses were legendary. Triple walls, massive moats fed by the Hosa River, and a scale that dwarfed any other metropolis of the age. The Assyrians inside believed they could withstand anything, especially since the walls had proven impregnable for decades. But they hadn't counted on the scale of the rage arrayed against them, nor the tactical brilliance of the Medes and Babylonians. The siege began in 612 BCE, grinding through the punishing Mesopotamian summer. Inside, the last of the royal line, King Sin-Shar-Rishkun, watched his empire dissolve into dust, trapped in the city his ancestors had built with the enslaved labor of 1,000 nations. The Medes and Babylonians did not rush. They built massive siege ramps, they dug beneath the foundations, and they waited for the river. The key to Nineveh's destruction lay not in direct assault, but in exploiting the very waterways that defended it. A sudden, massive flood of the Assur River, either natural, manipulated, or perhaps divinely orchestrated, undermined the outer defenses, creating a catastrophic breach in the formidable walls. King Sin-shar-ish-kun, facing certain capture and torture, is believed to have committed suicide in his burning palace, choosing to perish in the flames rather than fall into the hands of the roaring Medes. The looting of Nineveh took months, stripping the city bare of its accumulated wealth and power, sending a clear, terrifying message to the rest of the world: those who live by the sword will be wiped out by the sword. But the job wasn't quite finished. A remnant of the Assyrian army, led by a general named Ashurbanipal II, managed to escape the carnage and retreated westward, briefly setting up a desperate, doomed capital at Haran. For 3 more years, they clung to the ghost of the empire, hoping for Egyptian intervention or a miraculous comeback, praying that the shadow could return. It never did. The Medes and Babylonians pursued them relentlessly, finally crushing the last resistance at Haran in 609 BCE. The once mighty Assyrian Empire, which had terrified the world for 300 years, vanished completely, utterly and violently from the map. It was such a comprehensive erasure that within a few generations, travelers walking over the massive grassy mounds of Nineveh had no idea that they stood on the ruins of the most terrifying empire history had ever known. The silence that followed was deafening. The peace bought with rivers of blood, marking the final, terrifying fulfillment of prophecy and the end of the Age of Terror. The Age of Terror had seemingly ended, replaced by an unnatural, suffocating quiet. But beneath the polished obsidian floors of Nineveh, the tremors were already starting. The empire that had been built on bone and iron, the ultimate killing machine, was about to discover the one enemy it could not defeat: itself. The wealth that flowed into the capital, tribute measured in tons of gold, cedar wood, and generations of enslaved peoples, was not a blessing. It was the poison that began to slow the heart of the Colossus. The sheer scale of the empire, stretching from the delta of Egypt to the mountains of Iran, was too much weight for any central nervous system to bear. Every conquered state, previously crushed and silenced, was now a potential fault line, waiting for the slightest internal fracture to erupt. Assyria's military, though still the finest on earth, was stretched thinner than a desert horizon, perpetually fighting brush fires along distant, unforgiving borders. The final, colossal reign of Ashurbanipal, the Scholar King, had been a magnificent, terrible crescendo, but his death left a void that no single successor could fill. He had obsessed over preserving knowledge, creating the world's most famous library, but tragically neglected the brutal, necessary politics of succession. He failed to ensure the continuation of the terror, and that failure was the first brick removed from the foundation of the world's most powerful structure. Suddenly, the court was a viper's nest of competing, weak-willed sons and paranoid officials, each claiming the mantle of the great king. The civil wars that erupted immediately following Ashurbanipal's passing were not mere squabbles. They were systemic breakdowns that drained the empire of the very resources, trained soldiers, unified command, and logistical coherence it desperately needed to maintain control over its vast restive domain. While the Assyrian princes were ripping each other apart in the streets of Kalhu and Nineveh, two shadows began to lengthen on the periphery. To the south, in the ancient marshlands of Sumer and Akkad, the Chaldeans, the people Assyria had relentlessly subjugated and exiled for generations, were watching. They were led by a man named Nabopolassar, a tribal chieftain who carried the simmering, ancient hatred of Babylon in his blood, waiting for the precise moment of weakness. Nabopolassar understood the Assyrian mind perfectly. The terror was their strength, but their arrogance was their fatal flaw. He began a slow, meticulous process, not of open rebellion, but of quiet consolidation in the south, leveraging the chaos that the Assyrian civil war provided like a tactical advantage. Every elite soldier lost in Nineveh's succession battles was a priceless gift to the man rebuilding the power base of Babylon. And in the east, lurking behind the massive defensive wall of the Zagros Mountains, was the second shadow, the Medes. These fierce cavalry-based tribes, once merely vassals paying grudging tribute to the great king, were now unified under the banner of Cyaxares. Cyaxares was not a mere politician or a hesitant prince. He was a ruthless warrior, hardened by a lifetime of raiding and conflict. And he possessed the tactical brilliance to understand that Assyria's strength lay in its mighty cities, and those cities were now fatally vulnerable. The Medes had watched the Assyrians execute their campaigns for centuries, learning the very tactics of rapid mobility and punishing siege warfare that were now about to be turned against their master. They were patient, waiting for their decisive moment, while the Assyrians, blinded by their own internal power struggle, convinced themselves that these barbarian tribes were still just minor annoyances, easily crushed once the real king secured the hotly contested throne. This fatal miscalculation became the countdown clock for history's most brutal empire. Imagine the scene. While the last vestiges of the Assyrian army were busy executing their own generals and raiding their own treasuries in the throes of civil strife, Nabopolassar declared himself king of Babylon in 626 BCE. This was not just a simple declaration of independence, it was a massive gauntlet thrown down, the first solid, undeniable crack in the very edifice of terror and absolute dominion. The initial Assyrian response was predictably arrogant, sending only small, punitive forces, confident they could swat away the Babylonian pretender like a bothersome fly. But Nabopolassar was ready. His forces, bolstered by the loyalty of the desperate locals and newly equipped with the training gained while serving the Assyrians themselves, ruthlessly smashed the first counterattacks. The seemingly unstoppable war machine had finally stumbled. This was the pivotal moment the psychology shifted across the Near East. For centuries, the very presence of an Assyrian unit caused immediate, panicked surrender. Now, Assyrian units were being defeated in open, decisive battle, and their commanders were being humiliated and executed. The news spread like wildfire through the subject kingdoms, turning quiet, generations-deep fear into volatile, explosive hope. Egypt, sensing the opportunity to finally free itself from the iron grip of Mesopotamian dominance, cautiously began to support the Babylonian cause with vast amounts of gold and necessary mercenaries, eagerly anticipating the sight of Assyrian bleeding. The entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the final verdict. The greatest empire history had ever known was convulsing in a devastating internal struggle, and the scavengers were circling, sharp-eyed and patient. The civil war raged for years, a horrific, unsustainable drain on every single resource, until finally a fragile and uneasy peace was established in Nineveh, only for the new king, Sin-Shar-Eshkun, to inherit a kingdom already half-eaten from the edges by external enemies. Sin-Shar-Eshkun faced an impossible, paralyzing choice: focus on the continuing internal purges to secure his violently contested throne, or risk everything by marching immediately against the fully consolidated power of Nabopolassar in Babylon. He chose to delay, a fatal hesitation that cost him the strategic initiative and the element of surprise. He was still obsessed with securing the capital when the real existential threat was the gathering alliance that intended to completely destroy the capital and everything it represented. The Assyrian internal collapse had provided the one thing no conqueror could purchase or steal: time. Time for Nabopolassar to solidify his rule over the southern plains and reclaim the glory of Babylon. Time for Cyaxares and the Medes to hone their deadly, unstoppable cavalry. And time for the subject peoples to realize that the shadow of Ashur was not, in fact, eternal. They had seen the blood of the Assyrians spilled, and the psychological spell of invincibility was irrevocably broken. The stage was set for the final, terrifying, and shockingly rapid siege. The air was thick, not just with the smoke of distant, dying provinces, but with the suffocating certainty of doom. Nineveh, the magnificent, the impenetrable, the great beating heart of the terror machine, was now encircled. It was a city built on the bones of 1,000 defeated kings, a city that had never known fear, yet now, fear was the only currency traded within its colossal ramparts. For centuries, the name Nineveh was synonymous with eternal dominion. It was the capital that swallowed the world, protected by walls rumored to be wide enough for 4 chariots to race side by side, guarded by a labyrinth of canals and fortifications that mocked the very concept of attack. Now, those towering defenses looked like a cage, trapping the greatest empire history had ever produced inside its own monument to power. The coalition army that arrived was biblical in its scale. It was a torrent of vengeance, 1,000,000 voices roaring the same desperate cry for freedom, led by the Median king Cyaxares and the brilliant, calculating Babylonian general Nabopolassar. They knew that if Nineveh stood, their vengeance would ultimately be repaid upon them tenfold. Nineveh had one fatal flaw. One vulnerability that the greatest military minds of the ancient world had overlooked or dismissed as impossible: the Tigris River. The river that fed its canals, that protected its western flank, was destined to become the instrument of its horrific end. For months, the siege was a grim stalemate. The walls held. The Assyrian defenders, knowing that surrender meant utter annihilation for every man, woman, and child, because they had taught the world what annihilation truly meant, fought with a psychotic desperation. They launched counterattacks, they rained arrows and fire down upon the besiegers, and they refused to break. The Medes and Babylonians hammered against the brick and mortar, but the city of sin knew how to endure pain. It was the master of inflicting it. But history sometimes demands a sudden, dramatic twist of fate. Ancient sources, often cloaked in prophecy and myth, speak of a furious, unprecedented storm. It was the summer of 612 BCE. The rains came down with the violence of a god scorned. The Tigris River, usually a benevolent guardian, swelled into a raging, uncontrollable destroyer. its waters rising faster than anyone in living memory had ever witnessed. The power of the flood was overwhelming. It did not just fill the moats, it began to undermine the very foundations of the city's majestic defenses. Under the sheer, unrelenting hydraulic pressure, a massive section of the outer wall, perhaps 2 kilometers in length, suddenly gave way. It wasn't chipped down by battering rams. It was dissolved by divine fury, collapsing into the churning waters with a roar that was heard for miles. Imagine the scene, the crash of the collapsing stone, the sudden, terrifying silence that fell over the besieging armies as they realized the impossible had just occurred. A massive, gaping wound was torn into the side of the most powerful city on earth. The Assyrian army, previously invincible in open combat, was now fighting a desperate, disorganized house-to-house defense inside the twisting alleys of their capital. The fight quickly devolved into a massacre. There was no quarter given, nor was any expected. The scale of the looting was unparalleled. Statues of winged bulls, the Lamassu, protectors of the city, were toppled and smashed. Gold, silver, and the accumulated artistic and military treasures of an empire that had bled the Near East dry for 3 centuries were dragged out by the ton. Every precious object stolen from Babylon, every cedar beam taken from the forests of Lebanon, every jewel plundered from Egyptian pharaohs, was now repatriated by force. This was the redistribution of wealth via apocalyptic violence. The libraries burned, releasing the accumulated knowledge of centuries into the humid air as black smoke. The grand palaces, where kings had plotted the subjugation of the world, became funeral pyres. King Sennacherib, the final, tragic ruler, the last son of Ashurbanipal, understood the finality of his defeat. He is said to have retreated to the center of his collapsing palace, surrounded by his loyal officials, and ordered the entire structure set ablaze, choosing to be cremated on the throne of his ancestors rather than be dragged naked through the streets of the city he had failed to save. The psychological impact of Nineveh's fall was seismic. When the Medes and Babylonians finally emerged from the smoldering ruins, leading cartloads of gold and statues, the world watched in stunned silence. The shadow was gone. The flames that consumed Nineveh were visible for days across the entire plain of Mesopotamia. This was not just a fire. It was the incineration of an ideology, the doctrine that military might and systematic cruelty could grant eternal dominion. The city that had taken the lives of millions was now taking its final breath. The destruction was so thorough, so absolute, that within 2 generations, people would walk over the rubble mounds of Nineveh and genuinely struggle to believe that such an unimaginable metropolis had ever existed there. The Assyrian Empire, which had governed from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, had vanished. Not faded, not declined, but instantly erased, leaving behind only the memory of terror and a horrifying lesson. The more brutally you rule, the more devastating the vengeance will be.